A 911 dispatch center in Hampton County, South Carolina is just chilling when suddenly, a guy's voice cuts through the quiet, and it's completely losing it. He's crying, he can barely breathe, and all he can manage to choke out is, "My wife and child. Somebody shot my wife and child." Seriously, the panic was real. 8 minutes later, the deputies roll up to this huge place, the Moselle hunting estate. What they found was brutal. Maggie Murdaugh, 52, was face down in the grass by the dog kennels, hit with a bunch of assault rifle bullets. Paul Murdaugh, her 22-year-old son, was slumped against a feed room door, killed by 2 shotgun blasts, one to the chest and one, well, it was bad. Now, the guy who made the call, that was Alex Murdaugh, big deal lawyer, part of this legal family that had practically run this corner of South Carolina forever. He was the grieving husband and father, right? But here's the twist, the part that gives you chills. Over the next year and a half, the whole world was going to figure out that Alex Murdaugh wasn't just sad. He was hiding something way darker. The kind of secret that unravels an entire legacy. What do you think he was hiding? This is the story of how a family's century-long reign of power and privilege collapsed into murder, betrayal, and a web of crimes so extensive that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend its scope. This is the Murdaugh family case. To understand what happened on that humid June night, we must first understand the Murdaughs, and the stranglehold they maintained on South Carolina's 14th Judicial Circuit for 3 generations. In 1920, Randolph Murdaugh Sr. was elected solicitor, the equivalent of district attorney, for a 5-county region encompassing Hampton, Allendale, Colleton, Beaufort, and Jasper counties. It was a position he would hold for 46 years. When he retired, his son Randolph Jr., known as Buster, took over. Randolph Jr. served until 1986, when he passed the torch to his son, Randolph III. By 2005, when Randolph III finally stepped down, the Murdaugh family had controlled prosecution in this region for 87 consecutive years. 3 generations. Nearly a century. One family deciding who got charged, who went to prison, who walked free. The family's influence didn't end with criminal prosecution. The Murdaughs also ran PMPED, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Elsroth, and Derrick, one of the most successful personal injury law firms in the state. They specialized in wrongful death and catastrophic injury cases, winning multi-million-dollar settlements with such frequency that locals whispered they controlled not just the prosecutors' offices, but the juries, the judges, and the very machinery of justice itself. If you were hurt in the Low Country, you called the Murdaughs. If someone you loved was killed, you called the Murdaughs. And if you were accused of a crime, you prayed the Murdaughs weren't prosecuting you. Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Alex, was born into this empire in 1968. Tall, charismatic, with a booming voice and an easy smile, he seemed destined to continue the dynasty. He joined PMPD and quickly became one of the firm's top earners, securing massive settlements and cultivating the kind of good old boy relationships that kept power flowing through the same channels it always had. In 1993, Alex married Margaret Kennedy Brandstetter, popularly called Maggie, the daughter of a prominent local family. They seemed golden, beautiful, wealthy, connected. They had 2 sons, Richard Jr., called Buster, born in 1996, and Paul, born in 1999. The family lived in a sprawling home near the town of Hampton, population barely 2,000, where everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew the Murdaughs. They also owned Moselle, a 1,700-acre hunting estate in Colleton County where Alex loved to spend weekends with his family and friends. It was their private kingdom, a place where the pressures of legal work and social obligations fell away. Or at least, that's how it appeared. But beneath the veneer of Southern gentility and legal success, something was rotting at the core of the Murdaugh empire. And it would take 2 brutal murders to expose it. Paul Murdaugh was 22 years old when he died, but those who knew him remembered him as brash, entitled, and increasingly reckless. Friends described him as fun-loving and loyal. Others saw a young man who believed the Murdaugh name would protect him from any consequence. On February 24, 2019, Paul was piloting his father's boat, a sea hunt, on the Beaufort River with 5 friends aboard. They'd been bar hopping, and Paul was heavily intoxicated. Witnesses later testified that he was belligerent, refusing to let anyone else take the wheel despite his obvious impairment. At approximately 2:20 a.m., traveling at high speed in darkness, Paul crashed the boat into the Archers Creek Bridge piling. Mallory Beach was 19 years old. She loved animals, dreamed of becoming a nurse, and had a close-knit family who adored her. When the boat struck the bridge, Mallory was thrown into the frigid water. Her body wasn't found for 8 days. The community was devastated. Mallory's mother, Renee Beach, would later say that her daughter's light had been extinguished by arrogance and privilege, and by a legal system that protected the Murdaughs above all else. Paul was eventually charged with 3 counts of boating under the influence causing death, but the case moved slowly. Whispers circulated that the Murdaugh family was using its influence to delay proceedings, to make evidence disappear, to protect Paul from the consequences that would have destroyed any other young man's life. Maggie Murdaugh, meanwhile, was 52, a devoted mother and active member of her community. She volunteered at local charities, doted on her sons, and maintained the social connections that kept the Murdaugh name synonymous with respectability. Those close to Maggie described her as warm, genuine, and increasingly strained by the pressures surrounding Paul's legal troubles. In the months leading up to her death, Maggie had confided in friends that she was worried about Paul, about the lawsuit from Mallory Beach's family, about finances. Some would later say she'd been considering separating from Alex. She'd even consulted a divorce attorney, though she hadn't yet filed any papers. On the evening of June 7, 2021, Maggie drove to Moselle at Alex's request. She'd been staying at their beach house on Edisto Island, creating some distance, but Alex told her she needed to come to the estate. He said his father, Randolph III, 81 years old and dying of cancer, wanted to see her. Paul was already there, planning to visit a friend but apparently delayed at the kennels, checking on a sick dog. Shortly after 8:30 p.m., a neighbor would later testify they heard what sounded like gunshots. Then, silence. At 10:07 p.m., Alex Murdaugh called 911. His voice was frantic, desperate. "I've been up to it now, it's bad," he told the dispatcher. When pressed for details, he repeated that his wife and son had been shot, that they were dead, that he didn't know what happened. Deputies from the Colleton County Sheriff's Office arrived to find Alex outside the kennels, pacing, appearing distraught. Maggie lay in the grass, killed by 4 or 5 rounds from a .300 blackout rifle. Paul was inside the feed room, destroyed by 2 shotgun blasts, one 12-gauge shell to the chest, another to the head that left his brain matter splattered across the walls. The initial investigation treated Alex Murdaugh as a grieving survivor. After all, he was a Murdaugh, a respected attorney, a victim of an unthinkable tragedy. Theories immediately swirled. Was this revenge for Paul's boat crash? Had someone connected to Mallory Beach's family finally snapped? Was it a burglary gone wrong? But as investigators from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, began digging deeper, cracks appeared in Alex's story. He claimed he'd been visiting his ailing father in Alameda, about an hour away, when the murders occurred. He said he'd arrived back at Moselle around 10 p.m. and immediately discovered the bodies. But there were problems. First, Alex's timeline was suspiciously vague. He couldn't, or wouldn't, provide specific details about his movements that evening. Second, a key piece of evidence emerged: cell phone data. Paul had recorded a video on his phone at 8:44 p.m. It was just a short clip of the family dog, but voices could be heard in the background, including one that sounded distinctly like Alex Murdaugh. If Alex was at the kennels at 8:44 p.m., that contradicted his statement that he hadn't been there at all that evening before discovering the bodies. When confronted, Alex changed his story, admitting he had been at the kennels briefly but claiming his memory was foggy from the trauma. SLED investigators, led by Agent David Owen, began examining every aspect of Alex Murdaugh's life, and what they found was staggering. Alex Murdaugh hadn't just been a successful attorney. He'd been running a massive, multi-year embezzlement scheme, stealing millions of dollars from his law firm's clients, many of them vulnerable people who'd hired the Murdaughs after losing loved ones in accidents. He'd stolen from a quadriplegic man who'd been catastrophically injured. He'd stolen from the family of his longtime housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who died in a suspicious fall at the Murdaugh home in 2018. Alex had encouraged Satterfield's sons to sue him for wrongful death, promising to help them get a settlement. Then he directed the insurance payout, over $4 million, into accounts he controlled and kept it. The Satterfield boys never saw a penny. By 2021, Alex Murdaugh had stolen nearly $9 million. He'd used it to fund an addiction to opioids that cost him tens of thousands of dollars a week, to maintain the illusion of wealth even as his finances crumbled, to pay off gambling debts and bad investments. And by June 2021, his law firm was closing in on him. The firm's CFO had discovered financial irregularities and was demanding answers. On the morning of June 7th, the day Maggie and Paul died, she confronted Alex about missing money. He deflected, as always, but the walls were closing in. Investigators began to ask a terrible question. Could Alex Murdaugh have murdered his own wife and son to buy himself time? To create sympathy? To distract from his financial crimes? The theory seemed unthinkable. A father, a husband, committing such horror. But the evidence was mounting. Gunshot residue was found on a rain jacket discovered at Alex's father's house. A jacket Alex initially denied owning but later admitted might have been his. The .300 blackout rifle and 12-gauge shotgun used in the murders were never recovered, but both were types of weapons Alex owned and had access to at Moselle. Then, on September 4, 2021, just 3 months after the murders, Alex Murdaugh called 911 again. He claimed he'd been shot in the head while changing a tire on a rural road. The wound was superficial, but the story made national headlines. The grieving lawyer had now survived an assassination attempt. Except, he hadn't. Within days, Alex confessed the truth. He'd orchestrated the entire shooting with Curtis Eddie Smith, a former client and alleged drug dealer. Alex had asked Smith to shoot him so that his surviving son, Buster, could collect a $10 million life insurance payout. The plan failed when Smith's shot only grazed Alex's skull. The attempted suicide by proxy was the final unraveling. Alex was arrested, charged with insurance fraud, and ultimately suspended from practicing law. The man whose family had been synonymous with justice for a century was revealed as a fraud, a thief, and a liar. On July 14, 2022, 13 months after the murders, Alex Murdaugh was finally indicted for the murders of Maggie and Paul. He was charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. He pleaded not guilty. The trial began on January 25, 2023, in the Colleton County Courthouse. It would last 6 weeks and become one of the most watched trials in American history, broadcast live and dissected obsessively by true crime followers around the world. The prosecution, led by South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson and prosecutor Creighton Waters, presented a devastating case. They argued that Alex Murdaugh murdered his wife and son to distract from his financial crimes, to gain sympathy, and to delay the day of reckoning he knew was coming. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. The cell phone video placing Alex at the Kennel's minutes before the murders. The missing weapons that Alex had access to. The gunshot residue on his jacket. His constantly changing stories. But perhaps most damning was the financial motive. Prosecutors showed that within weeks of the murders, Alex's thefts were about to be exposed. He'd already been confronted about missing funds. Lawsuits from the Beach family and others were closing in. The family's legal empire, the source of Murdaugh power and wealth, was about to collapse. Dozens of witnesses testified. Forensic experts detailed the trajectory of bullets and the precise positions of the bodies. Cell phone analysts proved Alex's movements contradicted his alibis. Law enforcement officers described his suspicious behavior at the crime scene, including the fact that he called Maggie's phone after discovering her body, as if trying to establish an alibi. But some of the most powerful testimony came from Maggie's sister, Marion Proctor, who described the close bond she'd shared with her sister and the devastation of losing her. From Paul's girlfriend, Morgan Doughty, who spoke of a young man who could be difficult but was loved deeply. From Buster Murdaugh himself, who sat stoically in the courtroom, watching his father be accused of annihilating their family. On February 23, 2023, Alex Murdaugh took the stand in his own defense. It was a calculated risk, and it may have sealed his fate. For nearly 2 days, Alex testified, maintaining his innocence while admitting to decades of lies and theft. "I lied about being at the Kennels," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "I lied about so many things. But I would never hurt Maggie. I would never hurt Paul." Under cross-examination by Creighton Waters, Alex's testimony unraveled. Waters methodically demonstrated every lie Alex had told, to his family, his partners, his clients, law enforcement. "Aren't you a magician?" Waters asked, voice dripping with controlled disdain. "You can make things appear and disappear at will, can't you?" Alex's defense team argued that the state's case was built on speculation, that no direct evidence linked Alex to pulling the triggers, that other suspects, including those with grudges against Paul over the boat crash, hadn't been adequately investigated. But the tide had turned. The jury had seen who Alex Murdaugh really was. On March 2nd, 2023, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty. Guilty on both counts of murder. Guilty on both weapons charges. The courtroom erupted, gasps, sobs, cries of relief from Maggie's family. Alex Murdaugh, once untouchable, slumped in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. The next morning, the judge, Clifton Newman, sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As Newman pronounced the sentence, he addressed Alex directly. "Over the past century, your family has been associated with justice and the law in this area. But you have disgraced your family name and brought shame to your legacy." But the story doesn't end with Alex's conviction. In the months that followed, even more crimes came to light. Investigators reopened the case of Stephen Smith, a 19-year-old whose body was found on a rural road in 2015 in what was initially ruled a hit-and-run. New evidence suggested he might have been murdered, and that members of the Murdaugh family might have been involved. Gloria Satterfield's death, the housekeeper who supposedly fell down the stairs at the Murdaugh home, was also reclassified as suspicious. Her family has filed wrongful death suits, alleging she was actually pushed. Alex Murdaugh now faces over 100 additional criminal charges, including money laundering, fraud, and embezzlement. He's been convicted on multiple counts of financial crimes and received an additional 27 years in prison. Prosecutors estimate he stole upwards of $9 million over more than a decade. The Murdaugh dynasty, a century of power built on controlling justice, has collapsed utterly. The family law firm dissolved. Their properties were sold to pay restitution to victims. And the name Murdaugh, once whispered with respect and fear in the Low Country, now means only betrayal, greed, and murder. So why did Alex Murdaugh do it? Forensic psychologists have debated this question endlessly. Some argue he's a narcissist who killed to preserve his self-image and avoid exposure. Others suggest he's a sociopath incapable of genuine empathy, who viewed his wife and son as obstacles to be removed. Still others believe the answer is simpler and more tragic. Alex Murdaugh was a man drowning in his own lies, addicted to drugs, desperate to maintain an illusion of success, and when that illusion finally shattered, he chose the most unthinkable solution. He believed, perhaps rightly, that he could manipulate the system he'd spent his entire life controlling. That sympathy would buy him time, that being a grieving father and husband would make him untouchable. He almost succeeded. But ultimately, this case isn't really about Alex Murdaugh. It's about Maggie and Paul, 2 people who deserve to grow old, to laugh with their family, to live full lives. It's about Mallory Beach, who never got to fulfill her dreams. It's about Gloria Satterfield and her sons, who were betrayed by people they trusted. It's about Stephen Smith, whose death remains shrouded in mystery and injustice. And it's about a community, Hampton County, the Low Country, all of South Carolina, that must now reckon with the fact that justice, for so long controlled by one family, had been corrupted from within. On June 7, 2021, in the fading light of a South Carolina evening, 2 people were murdered. The investigation that followed revealed not just a double homicide, but a century of unchecked power, a cascade of crimes, and the catastrophic collapse of a dynasty built on lies. The Murdaugh name will endure, not as a legacy of justice, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder that power without accountability breeds corruption. That privilege without consequence destroys everything it touches. And that justice, when it finally arrives, is both merciful and merciless. Maggie and Paul Murdaugh are buried together in Hampton Cemetery, beneath moss-draped oaks, in the land their family once ruled. Their killer, husband, father, heir to a dynasty, will die in prison. This was the Murdaugh family case, and it reminds us that sometimes the greatest monsters wear the most respectable faces. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Crimes and Consequences.